good to be with you, everyone. It's a joy to be here. I'll be home for Christmas. You can plan on me. Please have snow and mistletoe and presents by the tree. Christmas Eve will find me where the love light gleams. Oh, I'll be home for Christmas, if only in my dreams. Our opening words this morning come from John Philip Newell, a prayer that he wrote. Thanks be to you, O God, for the strong arm of those who have given us shelter in our life, who loved us from the womb and carried us as children, who guarded us like watchful angels and wept when we were in pain. Thanks be to you for the men and women whose passion for the poor is undying, whose prayer for the oppressed is tender, whose defense of the wronged is fierce. Grant us the strength to cry for justice, to be patient for peace, to be angry for love. Grant us the grace of a strong soul, O God. Grant us the grace to be strong. I think on some level it's safe. Safe to say that some part of us or all of us longs for some kind of what we might call home. I'll Be Home for Christmas was first released by Bing Crosby in 1943, that song, during World War II. And it was a gruelingly long war. The song spoke to, a soldier's longing and to return to their loved ones. With us suffering through the coronavirus for going on 10 months, I often have thought what it would have been like to endure such a tragedy like a war that lasted not just months, but years. Songs of such longing perhaps held people together. Although it's interesting that the BBC actually banned the song during the war, fearing that it would hurt morale of the soldiers. And here we are, of course, in this day and age, in this time and place, many of us separated from family and friends, many of us longing to connect in person with those we love, with each other, to touch, to hold, to hug, to kiss. Losing holidays together, the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year's, and more. But the longing for home is not only a pining due to a separation in space and place. It also could be a yearning for times gone by, for a childhood lost with age, for the joy of youth, for some of us marked so strongly by the shiny images of presents under the Christmas tree, when we got that one gift that made our hearts stir with joy, that one tiny dream fulfilled that told us we were loved. And of course, I think of A Christmas Story and the tale there of that kind of nostalgia, that longing for the past. Of course, the longing for home could also be a metaphorical one, longing for a home that never existed, longing for a family that never was, hoping for a safety we may never have felt. Not all of us have happy childhoods. Not all of us have loved ones to return to. Not all of us had the safety and the care that we all deserve. So our longing for home might be a longing for something that never was, but perhaps should have been. I remember almost 2 decades ago being in a worship service at General Assembly, which is our denomination's annual meeting, a giant worship service, and the service was just absolutely magnificent. It was filled with energy and poetry and music, such amazing music that the 5,000 of us in that convention hall just sang with so much joy. And I remember weeping during the service because it just hit a spot in my heart that hadn't quite been filled in our movement. And it felt like I had come home. It was a marvelous feeling of coming home. Perhaps because of the music, perhaps because of this holiday season being a time many of us gather together with family. This is a time of year when many of us think on home, appreciating the warmth of our own, recollecting or even returning to the homes of our youth, and remembering those who don't have a home. As many of you know, as we talked about earlier, I work for an organization in Bloomington that helps people struggling with homelessness. And it's this time of year that people are the most kind, the most generous to our organization and those we work with. People think on those without homes with generosity and care now, perhaps more so than any other time of the year. A few months ago, I was being interviewed on a radio interview, and the host asked me why I was so committed to homelessness and to the issue addressing homelessness and solving homelessness and ending homelessness. And it was a hard question for me to answer. Hard to find the words. I've never experienced poverty myself. I've never experienced homelessness. My parents didn't particularly introduce me to any kind of charity or social justice work in any significant way, but it seems to have always been with me. I lived in the metro New York area, coming of age in the 80s, when homelessness first really started exploding in numbers in the United States. It wasn't an uncommon experience for me to visit the city and see people living on the streets, sleeping on the sidewalks, peeing in corners, and panhandling for change. I remember also as a young Catholic boy looking at the grandiosity of the church, just the utter expensive magnificence of it, the giant buildings, the expensive clothing, the rich ornamentation, and thinking that this wasn't what Jesus wanted. This wasn't what he asked for when he told us to care for the poor, for the least of these. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. For truly I tell you, whatsoever you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did so for me. As a high school student, I remember a video of Phil Collins making a big impression on me. Some of you may remember this video. This was the age of Live Aid and Hands Across America. Band-Aids, Do They Know It's Christmas, and USA for Africa's We Are the World. And Phil Collins had a video called Another Day in Paradise about homelessness. And I remember scrolling across the screen there, 3 million homeless in America in white letters on a black screen with Phil's face floating around. And that number really struck with me. That image held with me, even of course to this day that I'm talking about it with you right now. And it was also in high school where I dressed up as Santa to take pictures with other students, the very thin me, stuffed some pillowcases into some pillows into a Santa suit in order to make that deal work. And we took some pictures with other students in order to raise money for the local homeless shelter. And I later also did a challenge where I challenged some teachers to a pull-up contest to raise money as well. So these were kind of my background. So So a deep concern about homelessness has been there as far as back as I could be aware of such things. But as I think about it, as I really think about what's the real answer, what's going on there, I think there's something deeper there, something emotionally driven that explains the connection for me on some level. I think my interest and passion for people experiencing homelessness and for ending homelessness comes from my own longing for home. It's not the same, of course, not even remotely the same of the experience of actual homelessness. And I risk dismissiveness in what I'm saying, and that's certainly not my intent. It's not the same thing, even close, but there is a longing, a recognition that we all want to find our way home. That same nostalgia that emerges in a song like "I'll Be Home for Christmas" inspired me a belief in housing for all, a home for everyone. A home is made of at least two things: a warm, safe space to lay our heads and shield our bodies, and love. Right now, today, there are at least 600,000 people lacking in both. People living in shelters, in cars, in back alleys, and abandoned buildings on this very day, in this very moment, on sewer grates and parks in the woods. About 600,000 people today in this kind of experience, at least. The 3 million number from Phil Collins's video back in the 80s is actually a pretty decent estimate of how many people became homeless in a year, not just on a given day, but over the course of an entire year. And a number that actually holds up fairly accurate to approximations today. Nobody knows exactly how many people experience homelessness in a year. It's a very difficult thing to count, but that's a pretty decent estimate of how many people over the course of a year, 3 million, experience homelessness in the United States of America. And I really think when I think about so much of this time of year, I think of, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and I think of It's a Wonderful Life, and so many of the stories of generosity and care, Saint Nick himself and his acts of generosity to children, and of course Jesus, upon which the holiday is inspired. I just really think upon that Christmas spirit that emerges in those stories and those names and people and tales, that the Christmas spirit demands that this homelessness not go on, that it not continue, that we do something better and work for something better. That in an age of such massive wealth, that anyone could be a billionaire, or in many cases, a multi-billionaire, while others sleep on the streets, is just astonishing to me. There's no one that works that hard that they should deserve so much more than someone who ends up sleeping on the streets. Like that little boy stunned at the wealth of the Catholic Church he grew up in. I guess that same sentiment sits with me today, but not just directed at the church, but at society itself. Because interestingly, homelessness is a relatively recent sociological phenomena. It's not that old. There's always been people who've experienced homelessness in the United States, of course, and elsewhere. But in the United States, it's only been about 40 years that we've seen it in such staggering numbers, where I would describe it as a national tragedy, a sociological phenomenon, where it's become such a problem that it's dominates the issues in our country. And in the early 80s, when the numbers really began to explode, then. And we're still today, because it's relatively new, it's only 40 years old, we're still learning how best to help people without homes, It's still something that we don't know all the best ways to do it and the best ways to respond. Or at least we haven't solidified one choice or one targeted way of doing it. But one of the great paradoxes of homeless services over these last 40 years has been an interesting forgetfulness that homes are the answer to homelessness. We've gotten so caught up in a mythical meritocracy type framework that people need to earn their way back into homes rather than simply be supported in their efforts to live in one. This way of doing things is very common in most homeless shelters today. It's very common, and it now has a name which we call housing readiness, which is making people ready for housing. That we work with people while they're homeless until they're ready financially, emotionally, in their health, etc. That we wait until they're ready to maintain a home. But it didn't have a name. This type of way of doing homeless services didn't have a name for the longest time because it was kind of like the air we breathe. It was just the way that things were done. This is how you do it. People come into the shelter, you try and help them improve their lives while they're homeless, and hopefully people make it out. But the thing, though, about the housing readiness model is it created a permanent underclass of people experiencing homelessness. People who basically remained homeless until they died. They never became ready by those standards of readiness to move into a home on their own. And so they remained homeless permanently. And we have a name for it. We call this chronic homelessness. It's long-term or repeated homelessness due to disabilities. And here's the sticker. The average age of death for a chronically homeless person is 47 years old in the United States of America, 47 years old. So while the housing readiness approach dominated the scene to homeless services for so long, there was another way of doing homeless work that kind of was showing profound results, but was a little bit under the radar and wasn't nearly as embraced. And that's what we now call housing first. And the name kind of explains what it is. We don't keep people in shelters or on the streets for unending amounts of time until they're ready to be housed. We recognize that they're ready now, right now, which turns out to be true for almost everyone with the right supports in place. Almost everyone is ready for housing now with the right supports in place for them. And here's the thing, after years of growth in homelessness, once our federal government began to invest in housing first, those numbers, especially for those who are street homeless, those numbers actually started to decline. That for more than a decade, we saw a decline in the number of people experiencing homelessness, almost exclusively people who were experiencing street homelessness or chronic homelessness, even though the housing crisis, even through the housing crisis and the recession of 2008, we saw homeless numbers go down nationally because of the significant investment that the federal government started to put into housing first. And unfortunately, we actually have seen that number stabilize and start to grow over the last 4 years when that funding stabilized and that investment declined under the newest administration. But the news, I think, in terms of that decline, even gets better in the sense that, and this is a little wonky, but it costs about $20 to $25 per night per person to shelter someone 24 hours a day, about 20 to 25 bucks to do that. To provide a home and supportive services for a chronically homeless person, it costs about $35 a day. So not much more expensive, an ever slight increase for a home over a shelter with significant improvement in quality of life. And there's something that shelter doesn't do that housing does, which I think is really interesting to think about, is that housing actually improves people's quality of life so significantly that we see dramatic drops in things like arrest rates and emergency room use, and of course, the cost of the social service system itself. So much so that Housing First is not only an ethical choice for people without homes, but it's actually a cost saving choice too, which is kind of a miracle. The right thing is actually more affordable. And all of this leads me to the unavoidable belief that housing for all is actually within our sights, that it's possible, that we can do it, that we actually know how to do it, that I'll be home for Christmas or Hanukkah or New Year's or MLK Day is not only in our dreams, but it is a truism for all of us in this nation. It's possible. We know how to do it. The wealthiest nation on earth can overcome one of its greatest disgraces with the simplest of solutions: a home. A home for everyone. Shalom, amen, and blessed be.